It's something you see across history, really, and all around the world. These powerful leaders, sometimes, well, often authoritarian ones, rising up with huge popular support.
Yeah, figures like Julius Caesar way back when, or more recently you might think of Putin or Donald Trump.
Exactly. And it can feel a bit weird, can it? Because usually, if you ask people, they say they want leaders who are, warm, competent, empathetic. So what gives?
Uh-huh. There seems to be a disconnect there.
So today, we're going to really dig into that. We're doing a deep dive into this big cross-cultural study. It was published in Evolution and Human Behavior.
Right. And the core mission here is to unpack this prominent theory.
Which is?
So the idea that our own psychology, maybe these sort of deep-seated mechanisms for following leaders, might actually shift our preferences.
Yeah.
Specifically towards more dominant types when we think there's conflict between groups, like, say, during a war.
Okay, so conflict makes us want a strongman leader. We're going to look at why that might be a kind of fundamental human thing.
Yep, and how the researchers tested it. It's fascinating. They did this across 25 really different countries.
And we'll think about what it means for politics today and maybe even, our own gut feelings.
So this central idea, it's often called the conflict hypothesis.
Okay.
And it suggests that we humans have this adaptive followership psychology. It's context sensitive.
Meaning it changes depending on the situation.
Exactly. So when we see the world as full of conflict or our group being threatened, this preference for a dominant leader gets sort of upregulated, turned up.
Like a dial being turned.
Kind of, yeah.
But that's the paradox I keep coming back to. We say we want warmth and competence.
Right.
And there's not always clear evidence that these dominant strongman types actually make things better for their followers, like protecting the group effectively.
It's true. The evidence on outcomes is mixed.
Yet they still get popular support. So why does that happen? That's the big question we're trying to get at.
Precisely. And looking at it from an evolutionary angle gives us some clues. The argument is that leadership itself likely evolved as a way to solve group problems, collective action issues.
Like needing to hunt together or build something
Or especially dealing with conflict between groups. Think about our ancestors' groups needed ways to organize fast, defend themselves, maybe even attack rivals.
Okay, that makes sense. A coordinated group is stronger.
And you see hints of this in anthropological work, too. Like some Native American tribes, the Navajo, for example, they historically had different leaders for wartime versus peacetime.
Oh, interesting. Specialized roles.
Yeah. And even looking across species, you mentioned meerkats earlier, or capuchin monkeys. There's evidence for context-sensitive leadership there, too. Conflict often favors, well, typically males in those situations.
Wow, so it suggests something quite deep-rooted, maybe even biological.
Possibly, yeah. It points in that direction.
So this connects to that idea of dominance versus prestige leadership, right?
It does. The basic model is dominant leaders use force, intimidation, maybe fear. Prestige leaders gain influence through respect, showing expertise, being generous, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Though, it's worth noting, some recent work suggests it's not always totally separate. Dominant leaders might sometimes deliver group benefits too. It's not just about coercion.
Right, it can overlap. But why dominance specifically in conflict? What's the thinking there evolutionarily?
Well, ancestrally, think about it. A forceful leader could maybe inflict costs on enemies more effectively.
Okay.
They could potentially coordinate the group's response very decisively, maybe crack down on anyone not pulling their weight, the free riders.
So it's about being aggressive towards the outgroup and maintaining tight control within the in-group.
That seems to be the core logic, yes.
Yeah.
An aggressive defense or offense?
Okay, so let's get into the study itself then, because it sounds massive. Over 5,000 people.
Yeah, 5,008 participants. And from 25 countries.
And not just, Western university students.
No, exactly. They made a point of getting diversity. Western, non-Western, richer, poorer countries, different political systems.
Though you mentioned they were mostly recruited online and generally quite educated.
That's right. That's a fair caveat. It's not perfectly representative of all populations within those countries, but still remarkably broad for this kind of research.
So how did they actually test this? What was the experiment like?
It was quite clever, actually. They randomly put people into one of three groups. Different scenarios to imagine.
Okay.
One was the control group. Just, imagine you're electing a new leader for your country. Pretty standard.
Right.
Then the war condition. They asked people to imagine your country is at war and threatened by enemies.
Okay. Priming that conflict idea.
Exactly. And then the peace condition. Everything is peace and quiet in your country.
That setup seems really useful because obviously you can't just, start a war to run an experiment.
Right. It lets you compare these different psychological states, perceived peace versus perceived conflict in a controlled way. It isolates the key variable.
So how did they measure who people wanted as a leader in these different conditions?
They used two main methods. First, facial dominance.
Facial dominance, how does that work?
They showed people pairs of faces. Now get this, each pair was actually the same person's face, but digitally altered or morphed.
Wow.
One version looked more dominant, maybe a stronger jaw, heavier brow, that kind of thing. The other looked less dominant.
And these faces look like local people.
Yeah, they adapted them to look like typical faces from the participant's country, which is a nice touch, makes it feel more relevant. And people just chose.
Yeah.
Which one would you prefer as your leader?
Simple choice. Okay, what was the second method?
The second was more explicit. People rated how much they wanted a leader to have certain traits.
Right.
Things like competent, trustworthy, dominant, generous, strong, tough-minded, and warm.
The whole list.
Yeah. And then the researchers grouped these into broader dimensions: dominance traits, warmth traits, and competence traits.
And warmth and competence, those relate more to the prestige side of leadership.
That's right. They capture those qualities like expertise, trustworthiness, generosity, so you can compare preferences for dominance versus prestige.
Okay, really thorough. So with this setup, let's walk through the tests. Test one was about those faces, right? The contextual cues and facial preferences. What happened there?
The results were pretty stark, actually. The war scenario significantly boosted preference for the dominant-looking faces.
How much?
In the war condition, 54% chose the dominant face. Compare that to the control group, where it was 46%. And in the peace condition, it was even lower, only 42%.
Wow, so that's a jump of what, 8 percentage points from control to war and 12 points from peace to war. That feels like a real effect.
It is statistically significant and quite substantial. But here's maybe the most surprising bit. In the control and the peace conditions, the default preference was actually for the non-dominant face. More people chose the less dominant-looking leader when things were normal or peaceful.
Get out. So our baseline isn't the strong man. It's only when we feel threatened.
That's what this suggests. The preference for dominance seems to be switched on by perceived conflict, rather than being the default that gets switched off by peace.
That's a huge aha moment. And did this hold up across countries?
Pretty much. They saw this same basic pattern war increasing preference for dominant faces in 19 of the 25 countries. And crucially, no country showed the opposite trend.
Incredible consistency. Okay, so that's the implicit preference via faces. What about test 2, the explicit trait ratings? Did that match up?
It did, and it added more nuance. The war conditions specifically increased how much people said they wanted dominance traits, like being dominant, strong, tough-minded.
Okay, that fits.
But, and this is really important, it actually decreased preference for warmth traits.
Yeah.
People wanted less warmth, less generosity in a leader during wartime, according to this.
Less warmth. Wow.
Yeah. And interestingly, it had no effect on the desire for competence traits, like being competent or trustworthy.
So in a crisis, it's not like we just want more of all good leadership qualities. We specifically dial up dominance, dial down warmth, and keep competence about the same.
That's exactly what these findings suggest. It's a very specific shift towards dominance, not just general positivity.
That really sharpens the picture. Okay, so the experiments show context matters. What about individual differences? That was test 3, right? Looking at people's general worldview.
Exactly. They wanted to see if people who chronically see the world as dangerous or competitive show similar preferences, even without the experimental prime.
And this is where RWA and SDO come in. Can you just quickly remind us what those are?
Sure. RWA is right-wing authoritarianism. It's generally about seeing the world as dangerous, valuing obedience to authority, and social conformity. SDO is social dominance orientation. That's more about viewing the world as a competitive jungle, preferring hierarchical group relations.
Got it. So what did they find with RWA and SDO?
A clear link. People who scored higher on RWA, and also those who scored higher on SDO, showed stronger preferences for dominant leaders.
Both in the face choices and the trait ratings.
Both, yes. For RWA, for example, there was a 14 percentage point difference in choosing the dominant face between people lowest and highest on that scale. For SDO, it was about a 9-point difference.
So your underlying view of the world, dangerous versus safe, competitive versus cooperative, predicts your leadership taste, essentially.
It seems to mirror the effect of the experimentally induced conflict. If you already think the world is conflict-ridden, you already lean towards a dominant leader.
And again, was this specific to dominance, or did higher WASDO people just want more of everything?
Nope, it was specific again. Higher RWA or SDO predicted wanting more dominance traits, but it didn't generally translate into wanting more warmth or competence traits. It reinforces that specific conflict-dominance link.
Okay, really building a consistent case here. So finally, test 4, this was the big picture, looking at whole countries.
Yeah, moving from individual psychology to the macro level.
Hmm.
They look at country-level data, things like how much history of actual armed conflict the country had, and how much it currently spends on its military, like as a share of its economy.
Any connection?
They found one, yeah. Countries with more past conflict and higher military spending tended to have populations with, on average, stronger preferences for dominant leaders.
So the societal context seems to correlate too.
It does. The authors are careful to call this finding more exploratory. Correlation isn't causation at this level, but it lines up with everything else. It's another piece supporting the hypothesis.
Okay, let's just take a breath and recap. We've just gone through this really comprehensive deep dive. Evidence from 25 countries.
Yeah, using experiments, trait ratings, individual differences, even country-level data.
And it all seems to point pretty consistently towards this conflict hypothesis, right? That when we perceive conflict between groups, our preference for dominant leaders goes up.
That's the clear takeaway. It strongly suggests there's this potentially universal, definitely context-sensitive psychological mechanism at play, maybe an evolved one.
And it gives us a powerful way to look at what's happening in the world. The leaders who emerge, maybe why they emerge when they do.
Absolutely. It's not just some academic theory. It feels very relevant.
So thinking about those broader implications then, for you listening, if this psychology is real, if leaders or potential leaders understand this, could they potentially, deliberately play on it, stir up feelings of us versus them, or talk up external threats, specifically to boost their own appeal as a dominant figure?
That's the provocative question, isn't it? You think about examples like Putin framing conflict with the West, or some of Donald Trump's campaign ads talking about a dangerous world needing a, quote, tough, strong leader.
Right.
Now, the study doesn't tell us if those strategies work long-term or if they're ultimately good for the group, but it does suggest that tapping into that perceived conflict can, at least momentarily, increase support for leaders seen as dominant.
So what does that mean for us, for our future? Maybe it means we need to be extra critical when we hear narratives of conflict, Ask ourselves, is this threat real? Is this the only way to respond? And is the leader pushing this narrative the right one because they're truly competent, or just because they fit that dominant profile that conflict makes us crave?
That's a really important thought to leave people with. How do you critically evaluate those narratives of conflict, knowing the psychological tendency might be lurking within us?